Hello and welcome to the Wakbada Bassett Creek Oral History Podcast, where our guests discuss ways that they and other indigenous peoples have lived, worked, and played in the Wakbada watershed for thousands of years. This project was created in Minnesota Makoche, or Minnesota, the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Dakota people. The project was co-led by Dr. Casey Keeler and Crystal Boyd, with support from community partners. More information is included at the end of this episode. On behalf of everyone who contributed to this project, thank you for tuning in.
So good afternoon. I am here today with David Wilson for the Wakpadan Bassett Creek Oral History Project. Good afternoon, David. How are you?
I am fine, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me today about the time that you've been in the Wakpadan Bassett Creek area. So at what point in your life did you live in this region?
Well, I was born in this region in 1956, and I lived there continuously till, approximately 1974.
And were you right in Golden Valley then?
Yes, we were right in Golden Valley. It was then called Highway 12, which is 394, and Highway 55.
Okay. So you were born in the area. Do you know what brought your parents to that region?
I think they met and were living somewhere near Lake Street in South Minneapolis. My father had worked for International Milling and then switched jobs to Sears Roebuck and Company, which is located approximately on Chicago and Lake Street. And so they wanted to get out more in the suburbs. And so they found a lot. And the story goes that the man who was selling the lots had been drinking, and so he wanted to sell 2 lots, and my dad negotiated a deal on 1 lot, and then he talked to a contractor, and they built a small 3-bedroom rambler.
So you got almost a 2-for-1 deal there, it sounds like.
Yes, that's right.
And I understand that you also have a few siblings?
Yes, I do. I have an older brother, Chaz Wilson, a older sister, Susan Wilson, another older sister, Diane Wilson, and a younger brother, Randall Wilson.
So you were all kind of raised in this Golden Valley community.
That's correct.
Wow. On a double lot, so lots of room to run and explore, I assume.
Right. Well, it was a 1-acre lot, but at the time my dad first looked at it, it was just a big field. It had been just a big farm field. And like I said, the man who was selling it had been inebriated, and he was trying to get my dad to buy 2 lots. My dad ended up just buying the 1 lot, which was about 1 acre in size.
Okay, that's a pretty good sized lot, though, for the suburbs. The inner ring suburbs.
Real big lot.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So as a youngster, where did you go to school?
I went to kindergarten in Golden Valley. I went to Meadowbrook Elementary School for the elementary grades 1 through 4. And then I went to the Golden Valley Middle School, which was 4th through 8th, and finally on to Golden Valley High School, which was 9th through 12th grade. I graduated in 1974.
Okay, and I think what I have learned through this project is that Golden Valley High School today is Breck. Do you know?
Hopkins Breck. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's still standing. The building is still there.
It is still standing, although I think it's changed to some type of private or commercial.
Right.
Yep.
So when you were in school, do you recall having any American Indian curriculum or classes?
No, No, I distinctly remember celebrating Columbus Day and hearing the story about the Mayflower and the kind and good pilgrims, how welcoming they were to the Native Americans, and how they brought culture and sophistication to the native savages.
Wow. That's so common. I think even today still, unfortunately. Some schools, of course, are changing, but it seems to be at a snail's pace.
That's true.
Yeah. So, upon graduation in 1974, did you leave the Golden Valley area?
I went to, let's see, it would have been considered, I think, for about a year, and then I moved with a friend of mine to Phoenix, Arizona.
Okay. Your phone cut out a little bit. Where were you for about a year?
I was in the Robbinsdale area, living in an apartment.
Okay. I didn't mention this before we started the interview, but I also lived in Crystal for 5 years.
Oh, sure. I would have been right near there.
Yep. There are all these communities, Golden Valley, Robbinsdale, Crystal, New Hope. They're all kind of intertangled there.
They are intertangled, and maybe you're right. Maybe it was closer to Crystal. Yeah. So that's interesting, too. Not far from a lake that was called Medicine Lake, where my grandmother was for a short while.
Okay. And then after that time, you got out of the cold Minnesota weather and moved to the Southwest.
Yes, we moved to the Southwest. That was short-lived, and I came back, and I lived once again on Edgewood Avenue, as our parents had moved to Chicago. My dad had been transferred with Sears.
Okay.
And it was myself and a few of our siblings just kind of taking care of the house. I don't know if we paid rent or how we worked that out.
That sounds like a lot of teenagers' dream. Living in the house with no parents.
Right.
So growing up, did you know any other Native families or individuals in the area?
I knew of one Native individual, a male person who lived in Crystal.
Okay.
And I'd see him on occasion because I was a musician back in high school. I played in a band, and he would come out and see our band.
Okay. Did you keep in contact with him at all after high school?
I'd see him on occasion, usually somewhere like a bar setting or a place that had live music.
Uh-huh.
And he had been adopted into a white family.
Okay. I was going to say I interviewed two Native brothers who lived in Crystal kind of during the same period too, but it doesn't sound like it would have been them just given their family dynamics.
Right, okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I also know, based on some of the research that the Valley Community Presbyterian Church has done, is that you and your family attended the church when you and your siblings were younger?
That's correct. My dad had been raised more in a stricter religious family as a Lutheran. His grandfather was a Swedish minister, brimstone and fire type preacher. And my mother had been raised Catholic, and she attended the Pine Ridge Indian Boarding School, so they were a Catholic-run Jesuit ministry. So us kids by default became Presbyterians.
Do you recall attending church as a youngster?
I do. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So the church must have been brand new when you all started attending. It was built in the early 1950s.
Yes, I would have attended probably somewhere in the mid-60s, early 60s. And yeah, I would say it was fairly new. I remember they had the main church, and they had a residential house, probably a few 100 feet from the church where I went to Sunday school.
Okay. Do you remember back upon those times fondly?
Not really. I didn't really care for that experience very much.
So at a certain point, you elected to no longer attend the church?
That's right. As soon as I was baptized and my father mostly stopped pressuring me or us to go, then I didn't care to attend anymore.
Oh, so were you not baptized as an infant? Were you baptized?
Yes, I was baptized. I'm
Okay.
not sure I was. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it will be interesting to look at these church records. I'll have to ask the folks that I've been working on this project with if they have those, and we could provide a copy for you if that's something you would like to see.
Oh, I'm open about it. It wouldn't matter to me to really see it.
Okay. So thinking about... go ahead.
I didn't feel a real closeness there. There were some nice individuals, but I didn't really feel a closeness. I guess I'll just have to say that.
Right. I think that's, so similar for a lot of Native people and their relationships with Christianity and churches.
Yes.
Nothing awful or horrible, but just not for them.
No, not for them.
Right. So when you were living in Golden Valley, did you all have any other family in the area?
Not in the immediate area. We had cousins, uncles, and aunts who lived in the greater Minneapolis metropolitan area. I think Brooklyn Center, Bloomington, Brooklyn Park, places like that.
Okay, so you were pretty familiar with the Twin Cities region then, and traveling to visit.
Yes, I was. Mm-hmm.
It sounds like also living in Golden Valley was a good experience, with your parents being able to access home ownership and have a single-family home for all of you.
I would say they were very fortunate because I don't think my father made a huge salary working for Sears, but in those days with the GI loan, you could get a house for next to nothing down, and payments were very low. So yes, they were very fortunate.
That's so interesting that you mentioned the GI Bill. In my own research, that's something that I'm really interested in and thinking about how Native folks were able to access the GI Bill, if at all.
Yes.
Especially during this time period.
Right. Well, my father was a Swedish-American man. He was a white blood, Native and French Canadian.
Right. But him being able to access the GI Bill,
Right.
the home loan portion of it, as a white veteran, then enabled you all as children and your mom, a Native woman, to access the benefits of home ownership.
That's exactly correct.
Yeah. So you mentioned, you lived in this area until a few years after graduation, then you went to the Southwest and eventually made your way back.
Right.
Did you see a lot of change in the Golden Valley area after you were gone in the Southwest for a few years and returned?
Oh, I think it was steady. You'd see more shopping centers, more of the commercialized ventures, the coffee shops, different things like that. It built out. When we were kids, there was a lot of open land. It was really pretty land. And so it changed greatly. The areas that had been just big open, these little streams, were now housing developments and commercial centers.
How long were you in Golden Valley then once you came back as an adult?
I'm trying to think. I would like to say maybe a couple years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I played music.
Okay.
And I didn't go to college. I jumped around a little bit with jobs.
Okay.
Because, I wasn't really up for the continuing education at that time.
Yeah, college isn't for everybody.
Yeah, it wasn't. In hindsight, though, I wish I would have pursued a more narrow track in that line, because I did a lot of different work and with varied interests and varied incomes, but a lot of it, the construction work and manual labor work, wasn't real steady.
Right.
Paycheck. Yep.
Right. Did you work at all in Golden Valley, or were you usually kind of leaving the region a little bit, or did?
Mostly the greater Minneapolis area.
So after leaving a second time as an adult, did you ever come back to Golden Valley? Were your parents still there?
They moved back eventually at Sears Roebuck in Chicago ended. They moved back to their home.
Okay.
And I may have spent part of a year after that there. I was working as a roofer, construction worker, and I was playing in a country group at night.
Okay. So you spent a lot of time in Golden Valley, both growing up and then as a young adult.
Yes, I did.
Yeah. Do you think of it fondly today?
Some parts of it. Mm-hmm. Some parts I felt like I never quite fit in.
Yeah. So that leads to my next question.
Yes.
When you think about Bassett Creek in this Golden Valley area, how do you or did you relate to the region as a Native person, if at all?
I don't think there was any knowledge or any information about the area. The only place that was designated wildlife area, in retrospect, is Eloise Butler Flower Garden. And of course, then I'd hear maybe, I'm trying to think who I heard it through, but just through a few people in the community that, this used to be Native American land. You know, they had a trail going through here all the way into Minneapolis, and it follows this Glenwood Avenue. And I'd start to slowly hear little bits like that about the area. But otherwise, there was nothing to denote Dakota or Ojibwe or, Anishinaabe people had ever once trekked through there.
Right. Is that something you feel like you learned a little bit more about as an adult?
Yes. Yes, I did.
So when you were in the Golden Valley area, and this question varies from each individual to each individual,
yes.
Were you or your family involved in any cultural activities in terms of American Indian cultural activities? Is that something you went to Minneapolis for? Did your family have a strong connection to your tribal community?
No, I think we didn't have strong connections for quite a while. As children, we didn't really find out about our mixed blood, our Native American side, until we were young teenagers. And then our mother sat each of us kids down and said, this is your bloodline on my side. These are the family names. Our grandparents came from Niobrara and Flandreau and Saskatchewan. And, here's the family names. So slowly we started to learn little bits of history. Mm-hmm. I think she had such a tumultuous and hard time at the Pine Ridge when her family unfortunately had to leave her out there alone when they moved to the Minneapolis area. She didn't know that her mother and father had left their home in Rapid City.
Yeah. So in a way, she was probably trying to protect all of you.
She was. And one thing she'd say is, if we were to act up, she'd say, you don't know how good you have it.
Yeah. That's hard.
Yep.
I think, having that kind of an experience too, where you don't learn about your Native history and family and identity until a little bit later in life, it changes to how you think about place, right? Maybe you would have connected differently to the land around you had you have known, like, I'm Dakota, my ancestors are from this region too.
That's right. One of our aunts, my mother's closest sister, Pauline, she would tell us little bits, I remember, as we were growing up. And I remember I'd get into scuffles with some of the neighborhood boys, and they'd call me names like Papoose or, something derogatory. I had no idea why they were calling me that.
So thinking about living in a predominantly white suburb, again, as a Native person, and maybe reflecting on this now as an adult, given the kind of timeline that you just shared about learning about your family and your history and your identity, how has living in a predominantly white suburb like Golden Valley informed your identity?
I think to a small part. I know when I was probably 12 or 13, I had a good friend whose family was Jewish, and their father had a friend who did a lot of research on Native American tribes, and they're kind of the ones who first started talking about the area and the Native people in that area, a Jewish family. So it's interesting how that goes around.
Right, absolutely. And thinking about the different folks, different communities, Native, Jewish, etc., who have called Golden Valley home over the years.
Right. Yes. I know in high school, when you're kind of in your formative years, I would say a good percentage of my friends were of different cultural norms than the standard Golden Valley, white upbringing, white values and things like that. I had friends who were Hispanic, who were Jewish. One was an African American, and kind of a mix like that.
So even though Golden Valley was predominantly white, there was some diversity there, particularly for those who sought it out.
Yeah, a small portion. In fact, one of my closest Hispanic friends went to Golden Valley High School, but because of financial concerns, his mother was a single parent. He lived in the north side, and we'd go pick him up in our car, to go to a movie or whatever we do. And he'd have all kinds of stories about getting chased down, him and his brother, and, being cut with knives and, just lots of different things.
Right. And I'm sure some of that probably had to do with race and racism, especially at this time frame. I imagine you all being, in your youth or early teenage years.
Right.
So Hahawakpadan is the Dakota name for Bassett Creek. What do you think about the role and importance of language and place names, particularly in predominantly white settler spaces?
Well, I think it's extremely important to name those original names that were given by the original inhabitants. I think it's extremely important, and I think along with those names there should be some type of education. And given the meaning of those names and why the original people, our native people, named them that way, I think it's just really crucial for native identity and for knowledge for the dominant culture to know that, you're on native land.
Right. This has been such a enriching part of this project for me is talking to people about place names. And it seems that the dominant population, a white population, is oftentimes resistant to changing place names. But when we think about places like Minnesota, Wayzata, Minnetonka, Minnehaha, Anoka, these names already surround us in so many ways.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right.
And we can learn so much from these names and what they mean beyond a name like Bassett, who that name comes from, an early white settler named Joel Bassett.
Yeah, I just find that abhorrent. They name it after, and a lot of these people, they've named different things, like just take Sibley County. He was not a real nice guy.
Right. I know they're changing the name of Sibley High School, or maybe they just did.
Good. Yep.
So this American Indian Oral History Project grew out of a land acknowledgement process. What do you think about land acknowledgement statements in general?
I think they're very important, especially with the internet and the web and all that information that's out there for people. I think sometimes we have to wave a flag to get people's attention nowadays, because the attention span is so short that it's extremely important that they know the identity of where they actually live, where they travel through and race through, and where they get their food from, that shopping center may have been a traditional campsite of the Dakota people. And I think it's real important, and some will take that in and many others probably will not, but still I think it's important.
Right, to think more critically about, not only the people that were in the land that we now occupy, 200 years ago, but what was that land even used for?
That's right.
Not just about the people, but the purpose, the use of that land as well.
Yes, that's right.
I think that's important too, and I like how you framed it, because, we know part of settler colonialism is this notion that Native people weren't using the land in supposedly productive ways. That the land was supposed to be farmed, but in like a very Euro-American form of farming, and with fences and this individual property ownership. But we know Native people used the land in extremely productive, but also respectful ways that aren't as visible, because it was, responsible to the environment as well.
Yes, and it wasn't making a big dollar sign for somebody in their company and upward and onward. The dominant culture values making money.
Right.
Making money, sticking to their rules. And if you don't stick to their rules and their thoughts about everything from religion to laws, then for some reason you're wrong, or you're backwards, or you're uneducated.
Right. Yeah, there's so much surrounding land and land use and who has access to land, past and present, that needs to be really thought about and discussed between so many community members, Native and non-Native.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And when I lived in Gold Valley in my early 20s, I participated in cultural events in Minneapolis, per se, because there really weren't any out in the suburbs. I played with a group who we played for the AIM celebrations, the 25th anniversary We played for Clyde Belcourt's honoring, different things like that. And you never heard about things like that out in the suburbs. It was always my native friends who lived in Minneapolis or were connected somehow with East Franklin.
I'm glad you mentioned that because, you did share kind of your age with us and, you were coming of age, your teenage years, early 20s when AIM was really getting off the ground in Minneapolis.
Sure was. Yep.
But you kind of saw like a hard and fast boundary between AIM and Minneapolis and not really permeating into the suburbs at all.
Not at all. They didn't want it. People in the suburbs didn't want that. That was city things. And the cities at that time, too, especially in the mid-'60s, later '60s, we had a lot of riots. Riots on the north side. Riots over south. You had just the depredation of East Franklin Avenue in those days.
Yeah. I'm thinking there's two other gentlemen that I've interviewed for this project that are probably a similar age to you that shared similar stories of growing up in the West Metro. One, I believe, was in Golden Valley, Hopkins area, and the other one was in Plymouth, but coming into Minneapolis to participate in AIM activities as well.
Right.
So that must have been pretty formative during that time frame and your age.
Yes, and we have relatives at the Prairie Island community, the Owen family, and through their mother, our family is related. Our mother's was related to their mother through the bloodline, and so they were very active in Native causes, and they would speak out on things, and they were all spiritual family. So I learned a lot down there from them.
Right. That was nice that you were able to have that connection there, too.
I was very fortunate.
So thinking back about land acknowledgements, after land acknowledgements are created responsibly, what do you see as important follow-up or supplementary work that should follow a land acknowledgement statement? So it's not just an end to the process.
Well, I'm not sure if this would address that, but I think place names, Dakota names for places are important. There should be some type of like historical sign. Right. Even look like what you see at the roadside rest. They say, historical marker. Well, something of that type. This land was originally inhabited by Dakota and, what other tribes.
Right.
And this is the name they gave to this area right here. And I think just information like that is really important still.
Yeah, that's a good point because signage is pretty accessible, right? If we're thinking about, a church could do that. If we're thinking about a larger institution like the University of Minnesota could do that.
They sure could.
I know since I've been here at the University of Wisconsin, they've also put in a plaque on campus acknowledging the Ho-Chunk history here. So that's something that can be done, on an institutional or organizational level, but also like at a city level as well. Yeah. Or at specific sites like the Bassett Creek, right?
Exactly right. And signage people look at. They want to read it. They want to know. And I think communities and churches investing in people who can talk to these place areas and cultural areas is also very important. Native speakers.
Right, like having follow-up opportunities to engage Native people?
Yes. Yes. I think it's really key.
I like that too because it reminds people that Native people are still here today.
Yes. Yes, ever so.
So the next question is a little bit geared towards the environment and thinking about the Haha-Wakpadon Bassett Creek watershed. So is there any advice that you would like to give those who help manage the watershed today and the surrounding areas as well? Any particular changes or initiatives that you would like to see?
Yes, I would like to see buffers by the Bassett Creek areas for lawn fertilizer runoff, because it's not only has affected that watershed, but all the animals, birds, living things who have depended on that for eons to live. So I would like to see setbacks for fertilizer and that type of thing. I would like an area to the watershed that's left native.
Yeah.
Because those can also act as a buffer. And they can also provide a place for animals, birds, etc. to have a place to live.
Right. I like that you provide two concrete examples. I've also learned through this project that at least one, and I want to say two, golf courses kind of butt up to Bassett Creek. And we know that golf courses use lots of fertilizer to keep that lawn green.
Yes.
And the restoration of, designated natural areas would be a minimum, right? Like, it'd be great to see all of it be restored to how it once was. But absolutely, those natural areas that have since been filled in allow for the absorption of, rainwater, times of flood. They help in times of drought, but they also prevent so much of that nasty runoff from going right into the flowage.
That's right into the flowage, and then down the river, down the creeks.
Mm-hmm. And we know Bassett Creek, of course, flows right into the Mississippi River in Minneapolis.
Yes, it's a crucial water feed.
Mm-hmm. In my personal opinion, Bassett Creek is such a good place to start for something like this because it seems like it's much more accessible, right? It's a much smaller scale than something like the Mississippi River.
Exactly. Yep. I think so. I think with the right approach and the right education and community education outreach, I think there are enough people who may be interested in these type of things.
Right. When we look at the Bassett Creek watershed, like if you were to look at a map, it essentially starts in Minnetonka and then kind of makes its way through Plymouth and then Golden Valley and borders also along Crystal and I want to say New Hope and then into Minneapolis. So there aren't like a tremendous number of communities, right, that it's going through. It's just a handful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's in its day before there were all the development of modern day. It must have been quite an important waterway. Did you play in the Bassett Creek at all? I went down to it a few times. I didn't live close enough to go down to it very often, but I was always intrigued by it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because in the springtime, it could run pretty fast.
Right. Yeah, a few of the participants remember playing in it as youngsters or fishing in Medicine Lake, which is kind of what the creek flows out of there in Plymouth.
Right. Yep. Medicine Lake is one area that I went to, I would say, quite often.
Did you fish there, or did you go there for other recreational purposes?
There maybe a few times, but it was close enough to us, and with my grandmother having lived there for a short few years, as a native woman living there alone, it had a special appeal to it.
Yeah. back when you could ride bikes everywhere.
Oh, yeah. The road around Medicine Lake was gravel.
Yeah.
And Highway 169 was also gravel.
Really?
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah, now you're talking quite a ways back.
So much change over the decades.
It's changed greatly.
Was Highway 100 there then?
Yes, it would have been, and I think that was paved.
Okay.
That was paved for as far back as I can remember. But I remember 169 was gravel for quite a while, not improved. And Winnetka, where it met 169, that was also kind of more gravelly.
I suppose. I think of 169 as being bigger today and busier than Highway 100, but perhaps because 169 is further west.
That's what it is.
People were using Highway 100 a lot more earlier on.
Right, and before they did all the lane widening and things like that, Highway 100, even as far back as late 70s, was kind of a slower route. They still had, stoplights.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So things have changed greatly.
Yeah. Now I want to dig out some photographs and maps and look at the region and how it's changed over the years.
Yep, it's really something.
So is there anything that you would like future generations to know about your experience growing up in Golden Valley, particularly as a Native person?
I would like them to know that before all the development, those areas were wide open fields in many locations. Many neighborhoods were wide open plains. Mm-hmm. All the way to Medicine Lake and beyond. Medicine Lake, there was very little development. And it was a beautiful area. It really was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it must be so different if you go back to Golden Valley today to see how it is now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Places, people.
Right,
times
people.
Changed.
So in closing, is there anything else that you would like to share that we may have missed?
Well, I'll just mention that there were quite a number of railroad tracks that ran through Golden Valley and these other areas, and some of them were fairly service. And along with those, you'd have businesses that dealt in highly caustic production. We had a telephone pole company, a few blocks from our house where they used that creosote. And, as kids, we'd go down there and play in the fields, and you'd find all these old creosote logs. We didn't know what they were. And so those areas have been cleaned up, but it was industrial on a smaller scale, but some of the industries were highly toxic.
Mm-hmm. And you were mentioning something about the railroad, and your phone cut out a little bit. Would you mind repeating that?
Yes, there were quite a few kind of main rail lines that ran through Golden Valley and probably Bassett Creek area too. I'm sure there's trestles over the creek. I'm guessing, I can't think of them offhand. There was quite a bit of railroad service in our area.
Right. Yeah, I would assume, given the proximity to Minneapolis, that
yes,
there were trains going through Golden Valley pretty regularly.
Right, heading west.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point that none of the participants have raised so far is, the role of the railroad and also some of these businesses, as you mentioned, using really elements that we know today are very polluted. I'm trying to think of the right word. High levels of pollution that would have done a lot of environmental damage that we're only learning about, today, 50 years later, and what harm has already been done.
And there were dumps along Highway 55, not far from Sweeney Lake, where you could just back up your vehicle, your truck, and throw out whatever you had in back.
Oh,
Paint
wow.
can, garbage.
So was
that
was that something that like individual homeowners would go to?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Like before garbage service?
Businesses. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, so then you would also assume that there's seepage of that waste into the watershed as well.
Exactly right. Mm-hmm. And it's been buried and covered over, but it still keeps seeping.
Yeah. Wow.
Yep.
So what we do today absolutely matters for the next generation and the next generation and the next generation.
It does for every generation.
Or
but
what
the
we
one before it does
right.
greatly affects what's coming down in the next generation to be.
Or I was going to say what we don't do in terms of cleanup efforts with this knowledge that we have.
That's very true too.
So finally, is there anything else you would like to share that we may have missed?
I can't think of anything offhand. I've enjoyed this very much, and I appreciate the questions you've asked. I hope I've answered these without leaving too many gaps.
No, this has been really great. It's a little trip down memory lane.
Yeah, that's right. It sure is.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording. Thank you, David.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This project may serve as a model for other communities that seek to go beyond land acknowledgement. To learn more about this oral history project, please contact Hennepin History Museum. The project was produced following the standards and principles of the Oral History Association. In addition to this podcast, the interview recordings, transcripts, and narrator files included signed legal released agreements can be found at the Hennepin History Museum. Funding and other support was provided by the St. Anthony's Falls Heritage Board, Hennepin History Museum, Valley Community Presbyterian Church, and the University of Wisconsin. This publication was also made possible in part by the people of Minnesota through a grant funded by an appropriation to the Minnesota Historical Society from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Any views, findings, opinions, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this publication are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent those of the state of Minnesota, the Minnesota Historical Society, or the Minnesota Historic Resources Advisory Committee. Anaya chopta pecha wopira unkenichiapi. Thank you for listening.